Hi everyone, CPD here for fortnight beginning 8th of March. Obviously we are back in school, but the CPD is going to continue to be virtual until Easter, and then obviously we'll review the situation and hopefully after Easter we'll be able to go back to half the staff 1 week at the Cheval, half the staff the other week, but obviously more detail on that will follow. So our focus this time is once again research informed teaching and practice. So this is the third kind of in the series of these ones with a research informed focus, and obviously this ties in with this idea of every member of teaching staff having that inquiry question. Now obviously I'm not silly, I do appreciate that many people's inquiry questions will have taken a back seat during the period of remote teaching because you've been coming to terms with having to very quickly inquire, investigate, trial and evaluate new techniques of teaching for the remote classroom. So I do appreciate that, but I want to focus on a particular piece of research and thinking this afternoon or today, and I will then link it to our inquiry questions so we can start turning our attention back to those again, because of course it is important that we're always, whenever we're in the classroom, we're continually trying to improve our practice. Okay, so I'm going to start by asking you whether you're on your own computer or whether as a department you're sat round together watching this, to follow the link on the slide. So the PowerPoint was shared with you on the SharePoint hub, the CPD hub. Follow the link and it will take you to Nearpod. And some of you I know will have used this as part of your lessons. And this is by way of your little retrieval. So it's just a matching task. Now, I must admit, in the classroom, I usually steer clear of matching tasks because I think it's too easy for the students to just guess. And I think the level of challenge isn't always there. I would rather, if they've got to retrieve their knowledge on key definitions, just ask them to retrieve the key definition rather than just match. However, as with everybody else, I've had to adapt to different ways of doing things with remote teaching, and I wanted to try and keep that engagement and try and mix things up a little bit. And so I did try and use this on a few occasions with different classes. And actually, if you make the cards challenging enough, then the students are still thinking. And I guess the important thing from that is to then move on from there and then say, right, okay, I can see you had to have a few attempts at that one. Let's really nail that definition down. Let's think about those misconceptions. But I thought I would share that little example with you, but also let you have a try so you can kind of see this other alternative platform for yourselves in case you haven't already tried it. Okay, now in that retrieval, I purposely included a couple of things that link to what I'd like us to focus on today, which is this idea of deliberate practice. Now, you'll have heard of it before. I remember it's been mentioned in a few of our CPDs and kind of discussions over the last few years. And a lot of it is based on an original paper by Erickson, who was actually thinking about the field of music, the expertise of learning to play an instrument. And you'll have heard, and I included it in the retrieval, and to be honest, it's a little bit of a myth, this idea that if you practice something for 10,000 hours, you can become an expert at it and highly skilled. Well, it's a bit of a myth because you can practice something for 10,000 hours badly and certainly not become an expert. It has to be deliberate and it has to be guided by an expert. Otherwise, you're blindly doing what you think is going to help you get better, and it's not. So it's this idea of deliberate practice that I'm going to pick up on because there's a lot of talk about this at the moment in relation to teaching, and this idea of giving our students opportunity for that deliberate but guided practice. So I just picked out a couple of things from the original Erickson idea. Purposeful practice that knows where it's going and how to get there. So that would be a working definition, if you like, of this deliberate practice. And he goes on to say the right sort of practice carried out over a sufficient period of time leads to improvement, nothing else. So if we want to improve or we want our students to improve, that's what we absolutely have to do. Put simply, and I like this idea of mental models, we gain expertise through the improvement of our mental processes, and it's possible to develop then those mental models of what good looks like. So through that deliberate practice, you're almost internalizing what good is. And so at that point, you're starting to move closer to becoming that expert. Now, Daisy Christodoulou talked about this gap between knowing and doing. And deliberate practice is thought to be one of the ways that you can bridge that gap. So our students know stuff, but they need that expert guidance and the opportunity to practice deliberate practice in order to be able to confidently and competently do stuff, to put simply. Now, the Erickson research, as I said, it began by thinking about learning to play an instrument. And over the years, it's been applied to lots of different fields, sports fields, learning to play golf, chess. But interestingly, because we've used this comparison before, it's also been used and tested and kind of evidenced in the medical profession, even up to the point of surgeons. So when surgeons have been given a really specific, particular skill to be working on and being given opportunities to practice, obviously not live patients, but practice, and being filmed and given specific feedback on that practice, they have gone on to show higher skill levels and assessments than those that didn't use this deliberate practice method. So it is very much tried and tested. And what I'm going to try and do this afternoon is think about how we can use these principles in our classrooms and a bit more generally too. So when learners engage in deliberate practice, and I'm purposely using the word learners, not students, and you'll see why a bit later, but they're motivated, they have this compelling desire to improve. So I'm thinking about, and I'm sure this happens in all subjects, but I'm thinking about the art student who has seen a particular technique used by their teacher, and they absolutely want to be able to do this. They've got this compelling desire to improve, and so they're there and they practice, and it goes wrong, and they go again and they go again, and they maybe ask the teacher to model it again so they can just watch exactly how she was holding or he was holding the pencil, and they go again. But there has to be that desire to improve, and obviously that's about the culture that we create in our classrooms. They have to be willing to exert effort and challenge themselves to do better, because otherwise they would just accept second best. Oh, well, I'm all right at it, I don't need to work hard on that. So there's an element of kind of motivation, of course. They have to practice over a prolonged period of time. This is not a quick win, it has to be sustained. And of course, the teacher has to create those opportunities over a sustained period of time. Can't just be a one-off lesson. Oh, we're going to focus on this and we're going to do lots of practice and then job done. That's never going to lead to that kind of expertise and that internalising of a mental model. And they need to receive feedback. So I've kind of taken some of the principles from Erickson's original paper and some of the other things that are around on deliberate practice and put it into that idea of a flow diagram. So you have a well-defined task, and it has to be specific. So something that you want the students to work on. It can't be, I want them to get better at writing. You can't deliberately practice something as broad and general as that. It has to be really specific. They receive feedback on that particular aspect. So that could be from a previous piece of work. They then adjust that. And that's where they need your expertise to guide them, to model to them. How do you adjust that? How do you get better? How do you hold the pencil differently? How do you position yourself differently? How do you begin that paragraph in a more powerful way? It's really specific guidance needed for them to adjust it. And then you create those opportunities, lots of opportunities, for that deliberate practice and for them to adjust it and rehearse it and practice. Low stakes, low risk. Practice, doesn't matter if you get it wrong, do it again, let's try it with this example. And then they receive feedback again. But also, I don't think you can see because my silly head's in the way, but also that final box says reflection. You have to allow the child an opportunity to reflect on, oh, so why is that a better paragraph? How did I go about doing that? Why did that work better when I held the pencil differently, or when I took a different position, or when I did those steps in a different order? Why did it? Because that reflection bit, and that's the sort of metacognitive bit, is allowing them to internalize that mental model of what good looks like and what works effectively. So it links to all of those ideas about modeling. Got rid of my head so you can see the slide properly. So I wanted to give a specific example, because I've talked about how important it is that this is really specific, and that we don't just say, I need my students to get better at writing. So here's an example of how it might look in the classroom. So I'm using that flow diagram to kind of step it through. So imagine what I'm finding with my students is when they are writing evaluative essays, the conclusion is really not, they're not concluding, they're not bringing together ideas, they're almost just repeating what they've already said. So I'm finding my students have got really weak conclusions, and they're wasting time essentially. So if I've discovered this from a previous piece of research, previous piece of work, I'm going to do what I would always do. I'm going to do kind of whole class feedback on that previous attempt. And my whole class feedback might involve modelling to the class at a sentence by sentence level, how to construct good evaluative paragraphs, why I'm using the language I'm using. And then I give them an opportunity to do that step 3, to adjust. And that for me in the classroom might be as simple as them doing their green pen, and they have to reshape and redraft their conclusion based on the feedback that we've just received. But it can't end there. I mean, that part of the process I think is common practice across everybody in school, but it can't end there. We have to give them lots of opportunities to deliberately practice, not just to redraft one paragraph. So I might give them lots of opening and closing sentences and bits in the middle and ask them to improve it. Why did you change that word? Why did you change that sequence of 3 words to that is so much better? Brilliant. Why is that so much better? And really working towards them building up their own paragraphs, their own conclusions. And that might take several weeks. You know, not entire lessons every time, obviously, but I'm just keep going. I'm keep giving them opportunity for that deliberate practice, and I'm making it very obvious to them that's what we're doing. And at each opportunity, I need to make sure I don't skip that final step, that I give them an opportunity to reflect on, why is this so much better? Flick back in your book. Let's compare how far we've come. Look at how much better this paragraph is now, this conclusion, to the one you did 3 weeks ago. Why? Find it for me. What is it that's successful? And they're almost developing their own success criteria. Because what they're actually doing at that stage is they are internalising that mental model of what a good conclusion looks like. They've developed an expertise through deliberate practice, but through your guided help and support. They couldn't have done it on their own. If you'd have just allowed them to rewrite out their paragraph and make it better, of course no teacher would use that language, but unless it's very specific and guided and modelled by you, they can't do the deliberate practice bit. So it's very much got to be teacher-led, but gently removing those scaffolds, gently removing the control, if you like. And of course, throughout this entire process, the more opportunity we can give students to talk to each other, to peer assess, to review each other's work, and to generate their learning, the better. It doesn't have to all come from you. We want to encourage that student discussion as well, of course. Okay, so at this point, in departments, if you are sat together as a department watching this, I think it would be quite useful to just have a pause point and reflect, discuss. Think of a particular class, because remember, we need to deal with specifics here. And what is the specific action that you think that class, or even just small group of students, would really benefit from having deliberate practice on? The more specific, the better. As I've said, you can't deliberately practice just getting better at writing or reading or listening. You have to have a specific focus, and that's where they need your expertise. So essentially, use the flow diagram as your kind of model and think through, what is it for my class that I could create those opportunities for deliberate practice? And by the time you've all shared some examples on that, hopefully it will have kind of got that idea confirmed and concreted in your minds. Okay, so now I want to come back to this same principle, but look at it with a different lens, because a lot of the talk at the moment about deliberate practice is not actually in relation to our students, it's in relation to us as professionals. And a lot of it surrounds kind of the training of new teachers. But I think it's applicable to all teachers, because at the end of the day, we all want to just incrementally get better at what we do. So it's exactly the same flow diagram. But if we think about it from a teacher perspective, this idea of being really specific is equally as important. So we don't want to go into this idea of, I need to get better at teaching year 9 set 6. No, let's think really specifically. The first 3 minutes of the lesson are not as good as I would like them to be to ensure that calm and focused start. So that's the particular bit that I'm going to work on and deliberately practice getting better. So literally a 3-minute interval, because I've reflected and I've thought about it, and I think actually that's going to make a big difference to my teaching of this group. So this is the important bit. You need to ask somebody, and of course I could help facilitate this process, but this is something you can take ownership of as well. You ask someone that you trust, that you respect, to come in and just observe those first few minutes of your lesson and provide honest feedback to you. Now, this is the important bit. In the same way of students at step 3, they need that instruction, they need that guidance. You need to make sure that the person you're asking to come and just watch the first few minutes of your lesson is going to be able to give you that guidance, and it is going to be able to provide you with that feedback that you need so that you can move on. And sometimes that's quite a big step to take, because the person that you know will be able to give you that expertise, you might not have ever invited them into your classroom before. But this is about us improving, so sometimes we have to take that step. So you ask that trusted colleague to observe the first few minutes of your lesson, and they provide you with that honest feedback. And they work with you to design, in this scenario, maybe a script of the language that you're going to use, even things like where you're going to stand when you're welcoming the students, little signals or symbolic movements that you're going to use to ask students to remove their coats, to take their seats. All of those little things that an expert seems to do naturally. Somebody may be more experienced, but not necessarily, or somebody that teaches this same class that just seems to have it absolutely nailed. What is it they do? And it's only through having this really focused discussion about just those first 3 minutes that you can really identify that, because you can go and watch somebody teach. Let's imagine this year 9 set 6, and you found out there's another teacher in school that teaches them, and they've got them absolutely nailed. There's never any fuss. They come in, they sit down, they get on. It's a lovely, calm, focused start. You could go and observe their lesson, and you could come out and think, God, that was amazing. How do they do that? And be none the wiser. You've got to know what you're looking for. And that's not easy, because that's, again, it's about those mental representations. It's about those mental models. So actually talking to the person and working together on developing a script, where to stand, the specific strategies, is really powerful. And then you've got to practice. And remember, the practicing stage for the students was low risk, low stakes, no pressure. It needs to be the same for you too. So in this example, you practice your script in the mirror, practice changing your tone of voice, practice raising the volume slightly or lowering the volume, practice pausing, practice your hand gestures, practice where you want to stand. Like low risk, there doesn't even have to be any students involved at first. You practice and practice and practice until you feel really confident. And then you might choose a couple of classes to try this script out on, but low risk classes, classes that normally you have no concerns with in terms of this opening part of the lesson. And then you try it with Year 9 Set 6, as my example goes. and then you reflect. Was that better? Yes, much better. Okay, great. What bits do I need to keep and consistently use? What tweaks do I need to make and fine tune? And over time, and of course it takes time, you're going to internalize that mental model for that good practice, and it becomes natural. And that's why it's so hard sometimes when we observe others to see what it is that they're doing that is so effective, and actually for them to say what they do that's so effective, because they've internalized it and it's just what they do and it becomes natural. And I know some people will be kind of listening to this and thinking, oh yeah, that's fine for new teachers, but actually there'll be parts of anybody's lesson, including my own, where if I really kind of take that forensic lens and pick a particular element, this process would allow me to get better. And it will allow any teacher to get better. It's not just something that new teachers might concern themselves with. This particular example might be something that is more of a concern to relatively new teachers, but not necessarily. We all have those challenging classes sometimes, and those portions of the lesson where we think that could be better. And that's what deliberate practice is all about. And I think that's why I love the idea of this so much, because it's small and manageable enough to focus on just one particular thing. And that's why it works well for students, but that's why it can work really well for staff as well. So again, pause point, discuss, collaborate, but this time with the teacher lens. So think of your own classroom practice. Is there a particular aspect of your teaching, probably with a particular class, because we need to be specific, that you'd like to improve or to fine tune? And how could you apply that same flow diagram to your own deliberate practice? Like what would your specific task be? Who might you ask to receive that feedback? You might even be able to organise it with your colleagues sat around right now. And then from there, how could that develop? Okay. So I just wanted to pick up on this bit first, finally, really. It's not as easy as I might have just described in terms of this process. And I'm sure you've all just had some good discussions about a particular aspect of your teaching you'd like to practice. And I do think it's really powerful. But I think we have to be aware that step 3 is sometimes fighting against what we call cognitive biases. In fact, neuroscientists have used the phrase that habitual behaviours are immune to feedback. So if you have a particular habit in the classroom, you've always taught something a particular way, or you've always begun your lessons in a particular way, always use the same language, it's really hard to change habits. So you may well be given feedback about doing something differently, and it's feedback you've asked for, but it's still really hard to change and to challenge. And part of the reason for that is because we have what's called cognitive biases. And I mentioned these in the Psychology of Literacy CPD session I did a couple of weeks ago. But we have these cognitive biases, ways that we've always done something we've always believed, and they are hard to challenge. It's not to say they're impossible to challenge, and that is part of this deliberate practice idea. But it's important we recognise it. So I'll share this diagram, which is actually from a business background. The examples are anyway. But this is using cognitive science, our awareness of these cognitive biases. And the ones that I've circled in red are the ones I think are particularly relevant to us as teachers when we're trying to think about this deliberate practice of our own classroom practice. So Sometimes we are in danger of using what's called the anchoring effect. So we rely too much on the initial piece of information when making decisions. So the first test seemed okay. Do we need to look any more? Oh, I did this with, 9 set 2 the other day and it seemed to work. Do I need to scrutinise any further about how I do it with 9 set 6? Now, I'm not saying that's some sort of lazy teacher response. This is a cognitive bias that is almost beyond your control. These are things cognitively, natural shortcuts that our brain is trying to take. And if we're aware of them, it helps us to challenge them and overcome them. So we also have what's called a confirmation bias. So this could be a problem for us in our classroom teaching if we're not aware of it, because it could be the idea of, well, I've asked loads of students and they all seem to get it, so there's no problem here. I've sampled the room, 6 students that were able to give me the correct answer, so I can move on. That's a confirmation bias. And we all know deep down, just because 6 students have got it, it doesn't mean the entire class has got it. And we do have to dig a bit deeper and look a bit closer. And then we have what's called a courtesy bias, which is often about, well, this sounds really awful to say, but making life easier for yourself. But again, this is not a conscious decision. This is a cognitive process. Your brain naturally wants to take shortcuts. But the example they give there, the last time we discussed this, the meeting lasted for hours, so let's move on. I think the same could be applied in classrooms. The last time I tried that strategy didn't really work that well, so I won't try it again. Even though the evidence might tell us it's effective, and even though what we should do in that situation is that final process of the flow diagram, reflect, why didn't it work very well? What tweaks can I make? Do I need to practice more? Did I set it up in quite the right way? Really, as reflective practitioners, that's what we should do. But courtesy bias sometimes means we say, oh no, let's not rock the boat. And then the last one, an illusion of validity. And I think this would probably work, relate in terms of across classes. It worked fine in this particular class or with this particular group of students. It should work fine here. And I think as teachers, we have to be really careful that we're aware that we sometimes do have that cognitive bias through no fault of our own. We have to be aware of it and we have to challenge it, because in order to be the best teachers we can be for our students, we do always have to be thinking very carefully about that group of students. Will it work for them, or did it work for them, and what could make it better? And I think deliberate practice really helps with that process. So I'm going to finish there by just reminding us about our inquiry questions. And as I said at the start, I know that they will have taken a bit of a backseat recently, and that is totally understandable. But now we are back in the classroom. Once we've settled back in with our classes, do try to revisit that process and think, where am I up to in the cycle? So for many people, they are now, they did their reading and their research before Christmas, and they would have just about been starting in January to implement that change, to try that different strategy. And we can get back to that, and it ties in with this idea of deliberate practice. Implement that particular thing you're going to do better. Get yourself an opportunity to receive some feedback. Practice, practice, practice. Allow for it to happen over a sustained period of time, and review and tweak and reflect. So this isn't, the deliberate practice idea is not something new. In addition to this inquiry process that we've been asking people to engage with this year, it sits as part of it. And of course, have those conversations in your teams with your appraiser, with other members of staff that you think can support it, so that we can kind of get back onto thinking about our inquiry questions. Okay, so that's where I'm going to leave the session. Hopefully that also allowed for some good discussion in teams as well, and follow-up discussion. There will be one more virtual CPD before the Easter break, and that is on our lesson principles, so that will be kind of shared with you in 2 weeks' time. Okay, hopefully you all have a good kind of start back in school and getting those students back in the classrooms and settled back into their routines. Take care.